Welcome, everybody, to the 8th edition of the Deserve to Win podcast. As always, I'm your host, Eric J. Troutman, the czar of the TCPA. I got some really important news, biggest news ever. Actually, here you go. You ready? I'm wearing a scarf. And that's because it's cold outside here in California. Super excited to have you folks here today. Of course, we're coming at you from the Santa Ana Art Podcast Studio, where we're always at. PJ has always allowed us to be here. Always fun to be here. Huge news, though, in seriousness, not just my scarf. We have Beth Sprague from the Reassigned Numbers database, and I am extremely excited to have her here. Of course, the Reassigned Number database, critical tool. That's 4 criticals. We're going to break down why that is here in a bit, but super excited to have her so you can get all of your questions answered directly from her extremely knowledgeable mouth. And you're going to hear from her in just a little bit through the power of the Troutman firm. But before we get there, let's introduce ourselves. So we'll start with you, PJ, because I've already given you a little bit of love.
I am PJ, and I run a call center, and I also have a direct mail house known as Direct Marketing Wizard. I am the Wizard of TCPA World.
You are the Wizard of TCPA World. So you can't just say it like, I'm the Wizard of TCPA World. You're the Wizard of TCPA World. There it is. And look, right there on your little shirt, you've got your little...
I got the logo right
little logo, little hat right there, and we're going to have to splash that up on the screen. Now we've got a new guy who's doing our editing and our graphics, so you're going to notice, I think, some upgrades, some changes. So, let me know how you like it. In fact, while I'm saying be sure to give us a like, right? If we've got 500 people watching this, I should have at least 459 likes. I mean, there's going to be 40. There's going to be 41 people that are like, no, I hate this, and that's fine. I hate you too. I don't. But all of you that like this, you should say that you like it. Thank you, Pooja.
Hi, Queenie here, co-founder of the Troutman firm.
Wow, you're just kind of laying that out there, just moving on. Okay, that's cool. Welcome to the show. And Brittany?
Hi guys, my name is Brittany. I'm the Baroness of the TCPA World, and I am an associate at the Troutman firm.
Yeah. And last but not least, our brand new member. Who are you?
Hi, I am the Duchess and Gaila Kamunger, and I am the paralegal for the Troutman firm.
The paralegal, literally the paralegal.
The paralegal.
Yeah, no, you're fantastic. So lots to cover. Why don't we just dive right in? Where should we start today? I'm going to spin the invisible wheel. Let's start with Brittany. What do we got?
Okay, so a man by the name of Sam Katz filed suit against Cross Country Mortgage and other entities for violations of the TCPA. Specifically, Katz alleged that Cross Country Mortgage used an ATDS to make multiple calls to him in a week without his consent. Well, Cross Country Mortgage filed a motion to dismiss for failure to state a claim. Cross Country Mortgage argued that Sam Katz failed to allege sufficient facts to support each element of the claim. He stated that the complaint merely parroted the language of the TCPA. And as I'm sure you guys know, the complaint has to allege sufficient facts to support the elements of a claim. And the court found that the court basically sided with Cross Country Mortgage and found that the plaintiff did not discuss the contents of the calls or how many calls were made. He merely recited the elements of the TCPA elements, and that was it.
Curious, what district was this in? Was it in the 9th Circuit?
Way to put her on the spot.
Well, go ahead.
That's a good
Continue
question.
to keep her on the spot. Very classy, Pooja.
Well, I was just wondering if the new 9th Circuit ruling regarding ATDSs would be applicable here.
Well, so let's zoom out for a second. So a couple of pieces to this, obviously. One, it's a pleading standard case, but it's pleading standard around ATDS. And the court did not dive in, it doesn't sound like, into what the functionalities, features, and requirements of an ATDS are. So that wasn't really an opportunity to get into Borden. However, it just stands for the basic proposition, I think a very important proposition, that you can't just dump and run, right? You can't just say, we used an ATDS and then walk away. You have to provide those facts that support a plausible claim. Now, to your point, Pooja, it's unfortunate the court didn't talk about, and courts don't give advisory opinions, what those facts might be, right? What are the standards? What are the functionalities that Mr. Katz, who is, by the way, a notorious repeat player, what is it that this guy is aiming at? I was going to ask you, Pooja, you've come across cats.
Oh,
what do we think about cats? Do we like cats?
He's...
I like dogs. I don't know about cats.
Good thing Tori's not here.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's all you had?
No, what I think about him?
Yeah.
I think he's one of the less annoying serial plaintiffs.
Less annoying.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
all
we
right.
could put him on the slime chart, maybe.
Oh yeah, the slime scale.
I'd love to have a
yeah.
slime chart for serial litigators.
Oh my God! No, it's not a slime scale. That's different. Like lawyers are slimy. They're like, what's worse than slime? I don't know. I gotta come up with something. We'll dream it up. Sleaze, trash, dirt. Look at all these words that come to mind when we think of serial
I feel like a
litigators.
thesaurus here.
I think a bunch of people are standing up to apply. But now those likes are coming,
Yeah,
right?
there
There
you
we go. All right. Well, thank you for that breakdown. Pooja, what do you got?
Oh, what do I got? I got one of the hottest topics that a lot of folks are asking me about, which is surprising to me because for a TCPA world, we already know ringless voicemails are subject to the TCPA. The FCC finally, after years, declared that ringless voicemails in a unanimous decision are subject to the TCPA and cannot be used without prior express written consent. It was, I guess, alarming is the correct word, how many folks were reacting when I did a post on this or when this news came out. They were shocked, like, wait, if I'm using ringless voicemail, I now have to have prior express written consent with the Troutman 9 in order to call folks and not be in violation of the TCPA. Yes, that has been the case for years. Welcome, good morning. So, finally, we got some final authority stating from the FCC that ringless voicemails, so any of you guys that are using RVM, here's your authority, and please get prior express written consent or you will be in violation of the TCPA.
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic coverage. It's actually to me, it's amazing that the FCC acted on this for a couple of reasons. You want to break it down?
No, go.
A couple of reasons. One, the FCC is still not at full strength. Like, what is this? November of 2022, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, Biden has been president now for almost 2 complete years, still has not filled that 5th FCC spot.
It's Miss Jessica who's pushing this forward.
So Jessica Rosenworcel,
Yeah.
the chairwoman, is pushing this forward. But it's amazing that even a FCC that is not at full strength, only 4 members currently, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, were able to push this forward unanimously.
Well, to me, it's her voice that is pushing these efforts forward, right? Like her voice in the industry. I mean, she's causing some noise. So.
And the other unique feature here, of course, is that the FCC ruled on a withdrawn petition.
Mm-hmm.
This was the all about the, what was it? ATM, the all about the message.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just
ATM,
it's a very
ATM.
suggestive kind of the all about the message petition, which was brought several years ago and withdrawn several years ago. But you'll love this. There was then a senator who came forward to the FCC. I mean, think about this. Hey, look, dude, like self-awareness, okay? A senator comes forward and says, FCC, can you clarify that my ringless voicemail campaign messages are okay? That felt like a thud. That petition also withdrawn, which I thought was interesting, is of course that Jessica Rosenworcel and the FCC only referenced the AATM petition, did not reference the senator's petition. I wonder why. But nonetheless, it's very remarkable that without a petition pending, with 2 withdrawn petitions, and without the FCC at full strength, they still went forward with this ruling. But that, to Pooja's point, it doesn't really move the needle. Right,
No.
So it kind of asks you, why do they even do this? Maybe they just want like a little publicity win. I don't know. The FCC does weird things. They killed a carrier the other day. You should read about that. I'm not going to cover that today. We don't have time. I'm going to probably cover that next week. They killed a carrier, and I didn't like the way that happened. It was not the best. All right, we're going to throw it now over to the Duchess. Duchess, welcome to the show.
Yes.
Let me just say, Angelica, you have been fantastic. I could not dream of a better paralegal than you so far. And I'm saying this publicly in front of a bunch of folks here. So keep up the good work and don't let me down. But since you're here, what do you have to talk about?
I'm actually going to talk about the FTC.
FTC?
Not to be confused with the FCC.
No, do not.
So the FTC has kind of been creating a lot of noise around testimonials and endorsements and kind of in that new space of social media and, digital marketing and what that all looks like. And they're really starting to crack down on these fake reviews and, it could be employees that are writing these reviews. It could be paid endorsements and they're not disclosing that these people are paid. They might not actually even have the product, which is kind of what happened with one of the cases that came out today with Google and iHeartMedia. So it was a Google Pixel 4 phone that they paid on-air personalities $2.6 million, I want to say, to promote these phones. But the on-air personalities never had the phones.
Of course
so they
did.
never used
They were
these
using
phones.
iPhones.
They were using Blackberries.
So, the FTC gets wind of this, and they're bringing a possible $9.4 million judgment against Google and iHeartMedia.
Well, I mean, look, to me, this just speaks to how slimy not just litigators, but like regular celebrities are. I mean, look, I'm the czar. There are literally tens of people who want my endorsement on their product. I say tens. I mean, who knows? It could be more than that. But people come to me all the time, and they're like, hey, Eric, can we advertise on TCPA World? Hey, Eric, will you say that you love our dialer? Will you say that you love X? Will you love Y? And I always say the same thing. I'm never going to endorse anything. And it's not just that I wouldn't endorse something that I don't personally use, which is also true. But I mean, I'm an attorney, right? And I'm pretty well regarded as an attorney. So I feel like my voice just carries too much weight. So if I were to tell somebody, use X, use Y, I mean, that really starts to sound like legal advice. And then if you don't take my legal advice, that could be a problem. By the way, you should use the reassigned number database. But that's not an endorsement, you see, because I actually believe that. I'm not getting paid a penny to say that. But what these guys were doing, right, is the opposite. These, and again, I understand that the penalty is not going against the celebrities, which to me is ironic. The penalty is going against the people that were paying the celebrities. To me, the celebrities should be really ashamed of themselves. Like, why are you telling people to use a product that you've never used yourself? You don't even have the phone that you're talking about how great the phone is. That's absurd. To me, that's absurd.
I agree.
It's similar to going back to web form disclosures and being deceptive, right? When you're trying to capture TCPA consent, all this goes back to being deceptive to the consumer, right? And this is what regulators are focusing on. But it's when folks are using sweepstakes websites to get a mortgage lead and sell that off, right? Like, why are you being deceptive, right? It's always to make a quick buck, is what it really comes down to. And, the big takeaway from me there, at least for TCPA World, is how deceptive or how transparent are you being to the consumer, or how untransparent are you being to the consumer? So something to keep in mind.
All right. Well, appreciate that, Duchess, and so wonderful to have you here. Let's throw it over to you, PJ, the wizard. What do we got, man?
The wizard has news.
Oh,
the landscape is very hot right now.
The landscape
is very hot. The dialing landscape and marketing landscape.
Okay.
The FCC, the FTC, the Traceback Consortium, and all the attorney generals are being very, very active right now. So it's a very dangerous playground out there right now. In October and November, we've seen a lot of uptick in complaints, CIDs, and other inquiries from attorney generals and carriers.
And by we, you don't mean direct.
Not me directly, but the
in the
people
industry, the folks you know. Okay.
folks that I know.
This is from the street.
This is from the street. Yeah, this is from the street. So we've also seen out of Georgia, the GBI is now pursuing.
The Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
Yep, they are now pursuing robodialers as well, actively right now. So that was very interesting. The Anti-Robocall Litigation Task Force is also very active right now, working with carriers and also partaking in CIDs as well. So the FCC is also notifying carriers and being very active as well. And the state of Indiana has also been very active and recently put StarTel, which is probably the carrier you were talking about, out of business. And the CEO of StarTel is now banned from engaging in anything related to voice forever.
I didn't hear about this. This was not covered on TCPA World. We're going to have to cover this. Angelica, I'm putting you on this. We need coverage. Well, Wizard, do you want to cover this?
I can cover it.
We need coverage on this. I did not hear about StarTel getting whacked by the Indiana AG.
Yep. So he's even banned from consulting anything related to voice services forever.
What's the guy's name?
I believe his last name is Hall. I don't know his first name.
Well, I'll make sure this guy doesn't come knocking on my door anytime soon. Hey, can I join Reach? No, you may not. Okay, well, I appreciate that, PJ. Good breakdown. Now, what can people do if they're getting CIDs, if they're getting bothered by the GBI and other heavy-handed government organizations that are in all likelihood treading improperly upon these people's rights?
The first step is be proactive. Make sure your compliance is dialed in. If you do happen to get one of these CIDs or a query from a government entity, make sure you contact legal counsel, preferably the Troutman firm.
Do you know any legal counsel that can assist with these things?
Baroness.
I love it.
Just
Thank you.
contact
Yeah,
the
just
Baroness.
call the Baroness. That's exactly right. No, really helpful, and it is important for everyone listening to keep this stuff in mind. I mean, honestly, I remember 3 years ago, I was at the TCPA Summit. No, actually, I was at the MBA Regulatory Affairs Conference. And we were talking about the TCPA. And someone said, look, let's be real. There's no regulatory risk around the TCPA. It's all litigation risk. And now, I mean, it has completely changed. Litigation risk is still out there. It is still a massive, massive problem for people getting sued. It's still the biggest cash cow in the history of federal litigation. But regulatory risk, right? The AGs, the DOJs, the FCC, the FTC, really, any government agency with an enforcement bureau, it seems like these days, is going after robocallers, quote unquote robocallers. So the pendulum has really, really swung. And it's important for people to keep that in mind. But you're right, PJ. I mean, look, part of what we do, actually a significant part of what we do, is help folks that are being investigated, in my opinion, usually improperly. I'm just going to say it. Like, I love the government agencies. I'm not mad at you guys. I understand you're just doing your job. But the breadth of the net that's being cast right now, the good actors that are being swept up in these, they're truly dragnets, right? Dragnet, remember that old show, right? I mean, it really is an extremely broad effort. And sometimes it's like shoot first, ask questions later, I feel like. So thanks for that. I think that's really important for people to keep in mind. All right, so before we now get to our guest, who again is Beth Sprague over at the Reassigned Number Database, I want to tee up why this matters. And hopefully you folks all know this, but the TCPA basically says thou shalt not do certain things. And those things include making calls to numbers on the DNC. They include making calls using regulated technology. They include some other issues as well, content restrictions, etc. But thou shalt not do these things without the express consent or express written consent of the called party, right? That called party definition is so incredibly important in the TCPA world. If the called party is the person that you are trying to reach, right, then you can rely on your customer providing that phone number. And you can call that number safely, because even if the number has changed hands, or even if the customer gave you the wrong number, it doesn't matter, because you had the consent of the person that you were trying to call. And of course, once you know that that number has changed hands, then you can no longer call that number, because you are no longer in good faith trying to call your customer. Unfortunately, despite the compelling, completely common sense logic of that definition, the FCC and the courts have refused to apply the called party definition in that way. Instead, what everybody, and by everybody again I mean the FCC and the courts, have found is that the called party who has to provide consent for these calls to be placed is the current subscriber or regular user of the cell phone that is being called. So that means that if a customer gives you a phone number, or somebody supplies a lead, or an account holder, a debtor that you're trying to contact had provided a phone number sometime in the past, that phone number has changed hands. If you call that phone number, even if you have absolutely no idea that you're calling a wrong number or that you're calling a reassigned number, you can be liable because you do not have the called party's consent. The called party, again, by definition, is the person who actually picks up the phone, uses the phone, subscribes to the phone, not the person who gave you the phone number. Now, of course, that makes the express consent defense essentially illusory, right? Which is a very serious problem when you're talking about the single broadest restriction on constitutionally protected speech in our nation's history, and the most important defense is illusory. That is a serious issue, in my opinion. Very, very important from a constitutional perspective. But you set that aside, and you recognize that the courts are going to say you still have to have the unknowable. You have to have the consent of that person who's actually using the phone. But the reassigned number database makes the unknowable somewhat knowable. And the concept of the reassigned number database is every carrier in the nation has to report whenever a phone number is disconnected. That database is housed and administered by the reassigned number administrator, who is directed by Beth Sprague, who you're going to hear from right now. And what that database does, though, of course, is it allows callers to know safely whether or not a phone number has changed hands since the last time that they reached their customer on that phone number. That is obviously an incredibly important tool because, one, it allows you to avoid calling reassigned numbers. It allows you to avoid calling wrong numbers. That is important by itself. There's value there. But more importantly, you heard from Mike Greenwald, right? The number one most dangerous plaintiff's lawyer in the TCPA world. He specializes in one thing and one thing only: cracking people's skulls in wrong number TCPA class actions. We're talking about hundreds of millions. You heard about Citibank, right? In a case that was been certified, they're facing $1 billion in exposure. $1 billion in exposure, folks, because of wrong number calling. This database allows you to prevent at least calls to reassigned numbers. Now, unfortunately, it's not comprehensive. It can't read consumers' minds. So if a consumer fat fingers a phone number and gives you the wrong phone number, the reassigned number database is not going to help you with that. There are other services, right, that do help with that. So if you've got a question about, hey, what kind of vendors can help me to assure I'm not calling a wrong number as opposed to a reassigned number, give the czar a call. I can point you in the right direction, not an endorsement. But when it comes to reassigned numbers, right, the reassigned number database is the only comprehensive tool. And if you utilize it, there is a safe harbor. So although you might get sued, you'll have a defense if you are sued because you use this database. An incredibly powerful, incredibly essential tool for the TCPA world, which is why I'm so very proud to say, next, through the power of the Troutman firm, Beth Sprague of the Reassigned Number Database. Beth, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's amazing to have someone like you on the Reassigned Number Database, such a critical component in anybody's toolbox that's trying to avoid TCPA liability. Really interested to kind of hear your backstory, kind of who are you personally, what's your role at the Reassigned Number Database? Just kind of fill in the viewer so they understand who they're listening to.
Sure. So I am the director of the Reassigned Numbers Database, and it's with an S, numbers. Everyone always says number, but they're very Reassigned Numbers Database. So I'm responsible for kind of managing the database, managing the evolution of the database, the ongoing operations, and on one hand, making sure the service providers report their disconnects every month. That's very important. And then on the other hand, making sure all the callers are querying and that they have no problems and their subscriptions are working right. So it's just an ongoing daily operation.
It's an amazing title, by the way, Beth, to be the director of the Reassigned Number Database. I mean, that's a pretty powerful title. So can you just help everyone? I mean, look, I've teed it up before. I'm going to tee it up again. But in your words as the director, what does the Reassigned Number Database, numbers plural, database do?
Okay, so well, as you said, everyone in this world, especially companies, need to be compliant and want to be compliant. There's lots of reasons to be compliant, not just avoiding TCPA fines and fines from other bureaus or any private right of action, but just because people are not trusting a lot of companies. You want to protect your consumer brand trust, and so using the database, if you are a caller, if you're any enterprise, and we have all kinds, small, medium, large, making sure you're calling the right customer the first time. And it's only one database, so you don't have to use, you're not obviously prohibited from using whatever you want, but this is the authoritative, this is the FCC's database. It's the database of record. So we're pretty proud of how complete and accurate it is, especially since we just had it just had its 1-year anniversary. So we started offering the service on November 1st of 2021. So it's been a whole year in service, and I have been asked by different groups if I think that it's accomplishing what it was supposed to. And I think so. It's hard to know because there's nothing to compare it to, but we do have lots of numbers from all our analytics, and it shows that to date, about over 14 million calls and texts unwanted have been potentially avoided because the enterprises are using this database. So that's why you should use the database.
That's fantastic. And 14 million. Now, when you talk about 14 million records, I mean, ultimately, that doesn't mean that's the total number of attempts that have been prevented, but that's the total number of of numbers that would have been called by a call center, but for the repression mechanism that the Reassigned Numbers Database offers. So, I mean, if you imagine a 10 times saturation rate, It's not 14 million, it's 140 million unwanted calls to a wrong number that have been prevented already by the reassigned number database. And truthfully, that number feels low to me. I'll bet you it's actually substantially higher than that.
Yeah, well, that's just, those are the amount of queries that came back as a yes, meaning, yes, the number's been disconnected since the data consent or since the last time you, the caller, are reasonably sure you could reach your customer at that number. So those are just the yeses. But in total, there have been almost 300 million queries of the database.
And that's a comforting number. I mean, that's a comforting number, although truthfully, that feels low to me, right? It feels like there should be higher adoption, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Now, you mentioned the 1 year anniversary, November 1st. It's funny because November 1st was before this year, right? It was the Reassigned Number Database Day. I remember I did a blog, Happy Reassigned Number Database Day. But this year, you've been somewhat supplanted by OTSA, right? Which was the Oklahoma Telephone Solicitation Act, which was passed into law and became effective on November 1st. So unfortunately now everyone looks at November 1st as a bad date in TCPA world, whereas before it was a very positive date. But what's interesting is I actually think of a different date when I think of the Reassigned Number Database. I think of, December 12th, 2018, which was the date that the FCC first issued its ruling creating the Reassigned Number Database, authorizing, ultimately thanks to former Commissioner O'Reilly's hard work, a safe harbor for those who would use the Reassigned Numbers database, and sought submission by potential administrators. And I remember at the time, everyone was talking about Neustar was probably going to be the one that would step in here. And then some company called Somos, is that right? Kind of came in and snuck in. So I want you to tell me about that. You know, how did Somos decide to do the bid? You know, how did that process play out from your perspective?
Okay, that's some complicated history, but
hey, that's what we do around here.
Yes, so the when the bid came out, Somos had planned to go after the NAMPA contract because at that time Somos had won a bridge contract to administer the NAMPA. The NAMPA used to be administered by Neustar.
And the NAMPA is the North American, what is it exactly?
North American Numbering Plan Administration.
There you go.
Very important because without it, you know, we wouldn't maybe have numbers, you know.
There would be no phone numbers if it wasn't for NAMPA. That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And I've been associated with NAMPA, the organization NAMPA, for the past 20 years. It's just that the organization it's a federal contract. So that federal contract just happened to be with Neustar for several iterations of several contracts up until the bridge contract. And then Somos bid for the full contract, which is a 5-year contract. It started 2021. So Somos won that contract in the end of 2020. Part of the NAMPA contract is the Reassigned Numbers database. So we're really part of NAMPA, but a separate database.
I did not know that. I didn't know that the Reassigned Number database and NAMPA kind of went hand in hand. Now, is Somos happy to have the Reassigned Number database along with NAMPA? Or were you thinking, look, we just wanted NAMPA. Why are we stuck with this ridiculous database too? Oh, look at this look. This is a good question I just asked.
There's a lot of synergies between the Reassigned Numbers database and NAMPA. I mean, I know all the service providers from my previous roles at NAMPA, and so it's good to know them to help them along with their duties every month. But it is very different because this audience, the enterprises that use it, they're not necessarily telecom providers. They're everything but telecom providers. Well, that's not quite true, but mostly they're enterprises that are doing customer outreach for whatever reason, so many reasons.
Yeah, so the NAMPA folks that you guys are dealing with, right? They're the rarefied air, right? They're the fancy guys on the Titanic in the tuxedos, right? Whereas the folks that are using the Reassigned Number database, right? I mean, some of these, I'm looking at you, PJ, right? They're the guys that are like, the bottom rung of the Titanic. I don't know why I'm using the Titanic today as like my my wonderful little analogy. But yeah, no, this is a different class of criminal that you're dealing with here. That are using the reassigned number database. So I was just kind of curious, like from the mindset of Somos getting involved with NANPA. Hopefully, this is something that's positive and a revenue generator for you. I would think.
Well, the revenue is a little tricky too, because this is an FCC contract, and the way that the creation costs, the service providers, the carriers that are mandated to report this information, they also paid for it. So the money that we make off it, we are paying the service providers back for the creation costs.
Interesting. I didn't know
and then
that.
operation costs we have to pay for out of the R&D fund, and those are the usage fees that the callers pay to subscribe. So it's not going to make money, because any money over will go back into the fund. So it's not going to be making lots of money, but it's an FCC contract.
Well, that's interesting, because I mean, a lot of people, and I was going to hit this kind of later in the segment, but I guess we'll front load it. A lot of folks are concerned about the cost, frankly. In fact, the number one thing that I hear from people, because I mean, look, I'm a big supporter of this database. We were talking about earlier in the show. We're going to talk about it now. We'll talk about it again later. I think this database is fantastic. I'm one of the guys, the reasons why it exists. We can talk about that. I think it's great. I think everyone should use it. But a lot of times, a lot of folks are telling me, hey, look, Eric, this is a really expensive thing. It's very hard for us to invest in utilizing this database. Of course, we say, hey, look, it's more expensive to get sued. But I am curious, that the costs kind of being where they are the folks at the RND, I mean, are you guys aware of complaints about costs or concerns, I should say, about costs? Is there anything that can be done to abate? I mean, are we kind of matured in terms of what the rates are going to be? Might there be a change in the future? Just curious.
Well, that's another thing that is built into the contract that I work with on a monthly basis, actually, looking at the subscriptions and the fees and the usage and feedback. And I am supposed to provide feedback on an ongoing basis. We did actually have one adjustment back April 27. And we also have some big discounts for caller agents. Caller agents pricing isn't on the website, but our website says call us for the discounts. We have the responsibility to work with the industry and the FCC in this interim period to get to a point that it can pay for itself, or pay, to keep operating, as well as pay back the service providers. So it's still considered an interim period. Once it's completely stable, we're also going to have annual subscriptions. So I'm not saying it's not a done deal.
That's what I thought. Go ahead.
Beth, a follow-up question with the caller agents. How are caller agents defined if you're going to use that service? That's another question a lot of my clients ask is, can I have my third parties be considered agents, or do they have to be in-house agents to be able to use that service?
I usually leave that up to the entity. I don't know everyone's business, but basically if you are a caller agent, and we have several, some of them are actually advertised on our website.
Yeah.
Every client that they have to provide us a letter of authorization, because each client has to be separately identified for safe harbor reasons. So it tends to be for those bigger companies that do that kind of thing and fold it into other value-added services type thing.
Yeah. And to be clear, R&D uses agents that are third-party companies that offer the services holistically, along with some additional services. We think of DNC.com as an example.
And the costs are the same, though, right?
Like, it's actually, I think it's a little bit lower as part of the gateway through the agent, but now the agent might have a tack on to make it the same price, I think. I might be wrong. Is that right, Beth?
For everything above, I think it's $2 million a month. So it's quite a bit cheaper. for agents, realizing they have to do a lot of more work to fold it into whatever portals they have. So it is quite a bit cheaper than just regular caller pricing.
Yeah, so it's similar to what you folks do in the mail shops, PJ, where you can take advantage of high volumes, right? And you get a little bit lower if it's really high volume, but you have to get to over 2 million calls to take that. But the agents can aggregate, right, with a lot of different users, and they can deliver those, hopefully some of those savings on to the end user. All right, so that all makes a lot of sense. Let's actually back up for a second, because I don't think we've done a great job of explaining what the database actually does. And so, as I understand it, and you're the expert, the database has reassigned number information that's from the carriers, and specifically, all it has, if I understand this correctly, is a phone number and a date. The phone number being a cell phone number, and the date being any phone number, not just cell phone.
These are all carriers: landline, wireless, VoIP, interconnected VoIP resellers. Anyone that gets numbers from the NAMPA or another carrier. So it's all carriers, not just cell.
Can you use the database to identify what numbers are assigned to VoIP versus which ones are landlines, residential, versus which ones are cell phones?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. The query is just a telephone number, and the query that the caller makes, the telephone number and your date of consent. That's the only thing that you're querying.
Yeah, and so then going back then, so what the database contains is any phone number, not just cell phones, any phone number, and a date of reassignment or permanent disconnect, I think is the language.
A date of disconnect, correct? Yes.
Okay. So in order to utilize the database then, anybody that wants to scrub against the database to know whether or not their phone numbers are valid, that is to say whether or not they've been reassigned, would take the phone number that they wish to call and the last good date, which is the date that they either received the phone number or the last time they had a right party contact, that is to say they actually spoke with the person they're trying to speak with on that number. They take that date, they take that phone number, they send it to you folks, and we're going to talk about how that happens mechanically, and then a scrub takes place. And as I understand it, the reassigned numbers database, the administrator, you folks, Somos, come back with really just a single data point, right? It's a yes or a no.
Or doesn't exist.
Or it doesn't
exist
exist.
In the query.
Right. Because there's 4, right? There's yes, no data, and then doesn't exist, I think.
I thought there was 3, but Beth can clarify.
It's just yes, no, and I'll explain when it would be a no data. But there's just 3.
All right, so assuming it goes the right way, meaning that there's data available, right, you'll get a yes or a no. The yes means that the phone number has been permanently disconnected since the last good date, and that's a bad thing, right? That means don't call this phone number. If it's a no, then that means that the phone number has not, according to the database, been reassigned since the last time you spoke with your customer, so you should feel perfectly comfortable making that outbound call. At least you know it hasn't been reassigned.
Right, and the no will give you safe harbor.
And if there's a no, and you call that number, and it turns out, whoops, it really was reassigned, exactly. You now have a safe harbor. You cannot be sued for making that outbound call.
Is it that you can't be sued, or it provides you a litigation defense if you're sued?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not.
You can be sued. You can always be sued. You can get sued. You get sued for anything in the world. But if you get sued, you'll have a sturdy and reliable defense, which is great. But let's talk about that no data. Help us to understand kind of when that signal might come back.
Yeah. So the database was considered complete as of January 27, 2021. Because that's the magic date whereby all carriers, including the small rural carriers, were expected to report everything that they had been tracking and been tracking going back to July 27 of 2020 for like 95% of the numbers, because that's most of the carriers. So January 27, 2021, that is when the database was complete. So if you are a caller, if you enter any date that is January 20, prior to January 27 of 2021, you might get a no data. You probably will, because that's when it was complete. Prior to that, we don't have the data. If you put in a date of consent that's January 27, 2021 or later, you're going to get a no if the number has never been disconnected. And that's something that is sometimes lost in translation, meaning a number's never been disconnected. So you're going to get a no.
Never been disconnected ever, or never been disconnected since January of 2021?
Never been disconnected since January 27, 2021.
Got it. Yeah, and that's where, so there's two, I don't say complaints, again, I think critiques of the database. One is price. And the second is, it's as complete as it can be, but it is complete only back to this magical January of 2021 date, which, for many people, that's perfectly effective, right? Many folks have received phone numbers for the first time, opened new accounts, or received a lead since January 2021. So that is a very meaningful period of time for frankly, probably most callers. But there's definitely a segment of callers, particularly those that are doing debt collection or loan servicing, where, you may have obtained these numbers, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years ago. And you have to ask yourself, if you're calling a number that's 20 years stale, should you be assuming that number still belongs to your customer to begin with? But as time goes on, I think the lack of quote unquote completeness of the database becomes less of a problem. But for many adopters, it is still an issue. And I think that, you folks have kind of acknowledged that in some of the publications that I've seen you put out. It just is what it is. And you can't create numbers that you don't have, or you can't create records of reassignment that you don't have.
And one additional critique that I hear, and Beth, I'd love for you to clarify, is that if a consumer changes carriers, it spits back a disconnected response, correct? It does not tell you no query. It has no way of knowing if a consumer switched from Verizon to, say, AT&T.
The database is a collection of disconnected numbers. So if a carrier disconnects the number that's no longer in their network, whatever, the subscriber's gone, they need to report the number. If the customer just ports their number to another carrier, the carrier that it got ported away from is not supposed to report it as disconnected. So I don't know if that's what you're asking.
Yep, that's exactly what I was
misinformation. That's misinformation. Yeah, people are saying, right, well, hey, look, anytime, and I think, there's some folks out there, I don't understand it. There's some folks out there that are encouraging folks not to use a reassigned number database, like actively saying it's not a good database. To me, I don't get that. This is the official FCC authorized and mandated database. It's the only database where you can actually obtain a safe harbor. Again, cost is a legitimate concern, completeness is a legitimate concern, but things like, hey, it's tracking porting as opposed to just reassignment. As far as I know, that's just not true. And it's good to have you on here, Beth, to kind of confirm that.
It's not tracking porting. That's correct.
Yeah, it's a very common misconception, right? I do hear that from time to time. And it's nice to have you here to say, no, that's just not the case. More questions? That was a really good one.
Yep.
Okay. So that's how the database works. Now, I was asking you kind of before we started recording, my perspective is that adoption is not as great as I'd like to see it. Personally. And I'm wondering, are you liaising with trade organizations to try to encourage adoption? Kind of what are you folks doing to kind of spread the word, other than joining me on the podcast, of course, which is a very powerful way to do so?
Yeah, we now that we spent a lot of time just getting it up and running, we are now spending more time trying to be part of a lot of different trade associations, in particular debt collection, because you think you probably know the update to the Regulation F last year. It was also November. Part of those updates included the modern communications, and in the commentary of the rule, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau noted the use of a complete and accurate database such as the FCC's reassigned numbers database is an adequate database to use to ensure that the telephone number hasn't been reassigned. So it's a whole nother reason to use it for specifically debt collectors.
I mean, it is pretty funny when you think about it. The FCC has expressly said, this is our database. The CFPB is saying, hey, you might want to use this database. And yet people still ask me, hey, Eric, is there any other complete and accurate database that we could be using other than the RND? And I'm like, no, guys, just use the RND. But really there is, for whatever reason, there is kind of an interesting pushback. And again, the only thing I can think of is its pricing, or maybe it's just inertia, right? Or the feeling that, hey, everyone's looking to the left, looking to the right, saying, well, who else is using it, right? And until, peer organizations, I mean, I can think of like the major banks. I don't want to pick on anybody, but I can think of like the major banks who were some of the first people that were looking for the database back in 2014, 2015. I know this. I'll tell the backstory here. I know this personally. But they seem to be kind of looking at each other like, well, they're not doing it yet, so we're not going to do it, right? So that's why I was asking about the trades. I was wondering if you got in front of the ABA or the MBA, kind of really started talking to these folks and saying, hey guys, get your act together here.
I have done a little bit of reach out with the ABA, but not a whole lot.
Okay. Well, of course, I think you may know I'm the founder and soon to be president of REACH, which you're nodding your head. Everyone knows REACH. The Responsible Enterprises Against Consumer Harassment. We are 100% on board with having the use of the reassigned number database being an absolute part of our standards, at least as it comes to calling numbers past a certain date aged. Now, with respect, and I appreciate you, I'm not going to tell people that they have to scrub the reassigned number database if they just got a number within the last 30 days, let's say. I just don't think there's going to be much value there. Even at 60 days, I'm not sure there's a lot of value there. But when you start getting to about 90 days, right? I mean, in my view, people really should be looking to the database. Is that something that you agree with? Do you have best practice standards where you think, it should be at 40 days or 60 days? I'm curious kind of what the reassigned numbers database take is, if it has a take.
Oh, I don't have a take. As you know, the database is updated every month. When you query it, depends when your campaigns are, when your calling is. We have some subscribers actually that only do kind of campaigns certain times of the year. So we don't even see them use it. Sometimes they don't even have a subscription, and then they'll renew their subscription. It's only been a year. I already know this. They'll renew their subscription in 2 months. So I don't know how people planned, and I don't want to tell them how to do it. I mean, it's their business.
That makes sense. I mean, that's a cautious and intelligent and prudent approach, Beth. I was just trying to see if you'd say something you'd regret later, but you're too tricky for me. Well done. But so earlier in the show, before you joined us, we were talking through the problem with wrong number calling, how when a number is reassigned, there's really no way to know that happened until the reassigned numbers database came into existence. But even with the reassigned numbers database, there remains the risk that a consumer is going to receive a wrong number call, largely because another consumer put the wrong number in, right? And your database, as valuable as it is, it's not a comprehensive, say, list of subscribers to specific phone numbers. That's not how it works. It's a little bit more limited, and that's okay. But I think it's important for people to kind of understand that, even as they're looking at maybe adopting your database. Along that line, for folks that are kind of watching this going, all right, grumble, the czar says I have to do it, so I'm going to do it. What is the process, Beth? How do people sign up? And then once they sign up, I mean, what is the process? Is it batching? Is it one-to-one API? Like, how does it work?
It's very easy. It's basically someone has to contact us to start it. You can't just go online and create an account. You have to contact us. We initiate an invitation to you, and then you register, and you can invite whoever you want, and you can have other employees, different levels, having the same access or little access, whatever you want. As for how you do the querying, we have all different kinds of ways. We were required to also. You can do it right through the GUI, one by one. You can upload files through the GUI if you want, We have API interface. You can do API calls. You can upload via API. We also have SFTP transfer and uploads via SFTP. So we have kind of the whole gamut, depending on if you're just small or if you're huge. And some of the huger companies, the larger companies, they don't ever want to have to log in, which I understand. So we have learned a lot in the last year, and we have automated quite a lot of query response, that type of thing, finding out what you have left as of a certain date, so you don't have to be always logging into the website, logging into your account. So we have automated a lot, but either very small or very large, there's so many different ways to query it.
All right, and so if somebody wanted to get started, I mean, what's the website? What's the phone number? Give them a shout out, and hopefully we'll get some graphics up. I'm talking to my new editor here that can put the stuff on the screen so people can have it really easily.
Reassigned.us. Reassigned is a hard word to spell. A lot of times when you type it, it's REASSIGNED.us. That's the website.
Well, reassigned.us is the weirdest website. I gotta tell you, right? Because I mean, I go looking for it, and I'm like RND.com, no. Reassignednumbers.com, no. Oh yeah, that's right. It was RND.gov, no. It's RND.us. Yeah, that's. I mean, look, it was not the most. It's not the most intuitive of websites, shall we say. So let's help people to find you guys. And then is there like a phone number, or just reassigned.us is the way that people should go?
If you go to reassigned.us, we have a help desk. It's manned way too much. My number's on there, and 2 other administrators are on there too. So if you call that toll-free number, you might get me, or you might get Shanita, or you might get John. And hopefully you guys will meet them in March.
That's fantastic. When you say in March, you mean LeadsCon, folks coming out to the show? Yeah, Beth, and I love it that I'm seeing you folks out there at some of the larger trade shows. I think that's great. I really appreciate your personal investment in helping people to adopt and adapt and utilize this database. I mean, again, this is all, to me, it's all part of the larger push toward compliance, toward ultimately giving the consumers a better experience and getting, frankly, for the folks listening to my podcast, right, getting less TCPA lawsuits and getting consumers to feel safe to answer their phone again, right, which is what this is all about. So I applaud you and all of your efforts. All right, look, you've been a fantastic guest, Beth. I've already said I love the RND database. I encourage everyone listening to this. First, like this episode. Second, subscribe to our YouTube channel. But third, and equally as importantly, go to reassigned.us, get additional information, and if you're not using the Reassigned database, goodness gracious, you should. So go sign up. But Beth, now here at the end of the interview, I want to give you a couple of minutes. The question, and this one I think is going to have a very obvious answer, but you don't have to answer it in any particular way. But at the end of every interview, I always ask my guests the same question, which is, what can folks that listen to the show, call centers, major enterprise, sometimes lead generators, lead sellers, servicers, debt collectors, and carriers and platforms, what can these folks do to deserve to win? Which is the name of the podcast, of course. You see, I'm very clever. Deserve to win. What do you think, Beth?
Oh, stay compliant.
Okay, that was a softball, Beth. Stay compliant by using the Reassigned number database.
Well, I don't want to be too much plugging here, but yes.
Plug away. Well, Beth, you've been fantastic, and also you're a great sponsor of the new 2023 year-end review. We're going to see a beautiful quarter-page ad for the RND there in that review. I know people are going to respond very well to that, so I want to thank you for that as well. Beth, you've been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Wow. I mean, that was a lot of fun. I got to tell you, Beth is a fantastic guest. I just realized she's our first lady guest. That's kind of like self-reflective. I got to do a better job on that. But she was fantastic. She's absolutely lovely, very sophisticated, a lot of very, very intelligent insights. I've got some thoughts. Actually, I just want to tell my story. But before we get to that, let's throw it around. Pooja, I'm going to start with you. You were jumping into some pretty good questions. I know that you've got some clients that are asking you about the database just like I do. What'd you think?
Yeah, super informative. We needed her on the show, right? Like there's so many questions that Eric and I get asked that we don't have answers to, right? And Beth is a great resource to have by our side to answer those questions. A few notes. One thing that we had touched on is when you can get the safe harbor, right? Just want to clarify to folks that starts with obtaining the consent first, right? Having that good date, that right called party date. If you have bad consent and you think it's a right called party date, safe harbor is not going to apply, right? Your consent's invalid, right? So this all ties back to making sure your policies and procedures to obtain the Troutman 9, et cetera, are buttoned up, and then you're scrubbing, and then you're obtaining the safe harbor rule, right? You're not just using some random Janaya token, not verifying what source the lead came from, et cetera, and then scrubbing and then saying, hey, I'm good, get off me. That's not going to keep chronic and folks the sort off your back.
That's actually a really good point. Folks might get a little confused between the intersection of express written consent and the reassigned number database and the scope of the safe harbor. Again, I love Commissioner O'Reilly. He gave us a safe harbor. If it wasn't for him, can you imagine this? There wouldn't even be a safe harbor. Talk about how bad adoption would be then. But we do have a safe harbor, but Pooja is absolutely correct. The safe harbor only helps you if your consent is otherwise valid. If your consent is invalid, then it doesn't matter that the number wasn't reassigned. You still don't have consent. And so you still cannot make those calls lawfully. It's a really good point. Anything else?
Yeah, and then one additional point, going back to your point about how a lot of folks are against RND or don't want to use the scrub. I don't know that they're against it other than the cost, obviously, but I think it's more that a lot of folks are already using solutions where they think that they are able to get wrong numbers out of their database or figure out who's reassigned. And a lot of, our good folks in the industry, our friends, have solutions to help you with that, but that should be used to me at least, that should be used in conjunction with the RND to help verify those numbers before that July 27th, 2020 date, right? So if you have consent before that July 27th, 2020 date, and then you want to use other solution providers, to help figure out whether you're calling a wrong number or not, sure, that's fine, but use it in conjunction with the RND.
Completely agree. Fantastic. Well said. Pooja, Queenie, very, very good stuff from you today. I appreciate it very much. I'm going to go over to you, Britt. What do you think?
I thought she was great. I mean, one statistic that stuck in my mind was the reassigned number database stopped about 14 million unwanted calls. And I know that was pretty low to you, but I mean, that's still a fairly high number of calls.
Well, I think what she was saying, though, was 14 million yeses came back. To say that was only 14 million calls, that's not accurate because you're not going to just make one call per number, right? So to me, you got to assume at least 10x. So it's at least 140 million unwanted calls. But that still feels low. I mean, look, let's be real. The FCC, the carriers, the nation have poured resources of creation of this database. It is abysmal. I'm just going to call out industry. It's abysmal and it's sad and it's pathetic. If we're only stopping a year in 140 million calls, that's not right, right? We know that there is a tremendous number of wrong number calls that are made, not intentionally, of course, but still the volume of calls that are going to wrong numbers is extremely high. It accounts for, in my estimation, probably 10% of all the unwanted calls that exist. And when you talk about the number of unwanted calls, you're talking about, 72 billion last year, something in that range. So when you talk about stopping 120 million calls, to me, that's something. It's a step in the right direction, but it is not enough. It's not nearly enough. And again, using Reach and other resources and this podcast, hoping to raise awareness here. Look, we want to stop unwanted robocalls, right? That's what we do in addition to defending folks that are victims of frivolous litigator-driven lawsuits. We want to make sure that the businesses are calling only people that want to be called. So I agree with you. It's an interesting statistic. I think I had a different bend on it, though. I looked at that number and I thought that's just way too low. We got to do better than that. Duchess, since I'm looking over here at you, first of all, thank you so much for being on the show. It was fantastic to have you on board today, your first episode. You've been great throughout the show. And let's get your thoughts here. What'd you think?
Well, first of all, I'm super excited to be here. So thanks for having me.
You said that earlier, but you can say it again. That's fine.
Sorry. But I was kind of curious as to the statistics that come out over the next few years, maybe 5 years. I would say maybe 5 years would be a good measure to gauge the statistics, and maybe will compel more people, once they have something to kind of bounce it off of, compel them to actually see that it is a valuable resource.
Yeah, it's weird because we had Greenwald on the show, just like a few weeks ago, and then we had Tom Alvord on the show from Law HQ, just, our last episode, and you kind of put those two guys together, right? Tom was saying this database should be free. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting point. Greenwald was saying, if you don't use the database, I'm coming after you, right? And so I sit back and I think, when you're trying to drive adoption, and I don't want to, make our guest uneasy, because obviously this is a pay per use service, but if we could find a way to make this free, if we could find a way for Greenwald's message of, if you don't use this, I'm coming after you, you kind of put those two things together, I really feel like there'd be very high adoption. I really feel like you could, this database is a marvelous tool. It's a marvelous tool, but it's just kind of wrapped up in I'm not going to say it's like bureaucracy. That's not right. I just feel like it's not as accessible as it should be. I mean, let's be real. If it wasn't for TCPA World and Eric Troutman and the Deserve to Win podcast, would you even know about this database? Like, let's be real. Yeah. Like, people listening to this, would you even know this database existed if it wasn't for me? And that's a problem, right? I mean, look, I love being the purveyor of information and a true thought leader. Other people call themselves a thought leader. I laugh at them. I'm a thought leader. I tell you what's important, and I bring it to you, and I hand it to you, and I say, here is something you should think about, right? But it is it's somewhat problematic if I'm the guy that's introducing this concept to people. I don't know. It's odd. Anyway, PJ, we're going to end with you today on today's show. What did you think, man?
The database, I think, is very valuable. And I think as time goes on and more people adapt to it, it's going to be even more valuable. But as a call center, and a lot of call centers with all the changes that the carriers have made recently, it's harder to get in contact with the customers, even the right ones, right? So to me, it comes back down to cost. Is it affordable for the call center to use it? Also, is it not affordable? Because if you're not compliant, you might be looking at some heavy TCPA lawsuits and other fines and stuff that comes along with it. So I'm kind of torn between it, because I agree. I think it should be free, or at least more affordable.
I asked you earlier in the podcast, PJ, whether or not you used the reassigned number database. Having heard from Beth, I mean, does any of this kind of move you toward using it or move you away from using it?
It definitely makes me want to use it. And I would agree. Most people have no idea this database exists. One of my call centers 8 years ago when I started looking into it, and then it was Newstar that was kind of manning the ship, I should say. But most people don't even know it exists.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to end the show. I've been teasing this a few times throughout the show. I'm going to tell you the story of how the reassigned number database even came into existence, which is why it's frankly pretty close to my heart. We talked earlier about the scourge of wrong number calling and about the difficulty avoiding wrong number calls, strict liability, definition of called party, etc. What I haven't told you is that I was actually retained by a group of finance companies and other entities to do some advocacy to the FCC back in 2014, ahead of what became the 2015 omnibus, which we talked about earlier. And it was as a result of those meetings, and I can tell you exactly the name of the staffers that came up with the idea of a reassigned number database. It was a result of those meetings that the idea that wrong number phone calls were something that innocent companies were being, frankly, strung up on. And there was nothing they could do. That was the first time that the FCC had ever heard of that, believe it or not. The FCC learned of the issue from the czar. And, they were responsive. They couldn't give us what we really wanted, of course, which was that called party definition to be intended recipient. We talked about that earlier. That would make the most sense. That was, in my opinion, then and today, the correct result, the correct interpretation of the TCPA that would apply the defense of express consent properly. But if you can't have that, the reassigned number database is pretty good, right? I mean, it at least gives you a fighting chance to avoid making those wrong number calls. I thought it was a good idea at the time, and frankly, it took, 8 years, 7 years to become a reality, but it finally did become a reality. And now that it is a reality, it's unfortunate to me that I hear a lot of excuses, frankly. I hear a lot of people kind of dragging their feet on adoption, and I just don't like it, right? I think that this is a database that is a great tool. It is a fantastic tool. It's not perfect, but it is a critical tool, and anybody that is looking to be compliant, anybody that wants to make sure that they're not bothering people, making calls that frankly don't make you any money and just damage your brand, you should be looking at the reassigned number database. And of course, if you don't, you're at risk from guys like Greenwald. I encourage you, if you're just watching this show and you haven't watched Greenwald, which was episode, I believe, 5 of this podcast, go watch it. Go watch it, and that'll help you to better understand the risks that you're facing if you're not using this database. Well, look, as always, folks, we really appreciate you tuning in. Give us a like, give us a little subscribe, right? It's very, very helpful to us. And we really appreciate you. And hey, look, I'm not sure that we're going to do another one of these before the holidays. So this might be your last interaction with us, engagement via podcast before the holidays. If that turns out to be the case, happy holidays. We wish you a very good new year, and we'll be back with you soon. Thanks, everybody.